Good morning. It's Friday, May 17th. The war in the Middle East is now 224 days old. I'm Jonathan Schanzer, Senior Vice President for Research at Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. I almost fell off my chair last night as I was preparing for today's program. That's because 7 months after this war began, 7 months after Hamas slaughtered 1,200 people and kidnapped 240, the UN Security Council held a session dedicated to the hostage issue. I don't get surprised by much in this business anymore, but hey, I guess even a broken clock is right twice a day. More news and headlines coming your way now, live on the FDD Morning Brief. Our guest on today's episode is David Adesnik. He and I have been colleagues for several years now. He came to us from Foreign Policy Initiative, FPI, and American Enterprise Institute, AEI. But before that, he spent some time in Iraq, and he also worked for the presidential campaign of the late, great John McCain. Today, he's FDD's Director of Research, and over the last few weeks, he's been all over those bogus casualty numbers released by the Gaza Ministry of Health, aka Hamas. We'll talk about that, among other things, in just a few. 22 Arab countries convened in Bahrain for the 33rd Arab League Summit this week. Nothing good comes of these summits. This is the forum that created the Palestine Liberation Organization in 1964. The PLO went on to become a prolific terrorist organization. After 1967, the Arab League issued the famous 3 no's: no peace, no negotiation, and no recognition of Israel. That was the tone of the Arab League for decades. But then Egypt made peace with Israel. The PLO signed the Oslo Accords. Jordan made its peace. Recently, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and even Sudan also normalized. Scores of other Arab countries have unofficial ties with Israel too. The Arab League became a meaningless holdover from a bygone era of blind Israel hatred. But this year, the rhetoric feels like the bad old days. Gaza is dominating the agenda. The Secretary General of the Arab League, an Egyptian, accused Israel of historic aggression against the Palestinian people. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres also weighed in. He said the war in Gaza is the deadliest he's witnessed on the job. Never mind that Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad was in attendance, who slaughtered hundreds of thousands and displaced millions of his own people. In short, the Arab League is a cesspool of illiberal strongmen who wield anti-Israel invective to distract their angry populations from their collapsing economies and domestic repression. This tactic used to work before the internet. Will it work now? I'm not sure, but will that stop these dictators from grandstanding? Don't hold your breath. Now for your headlines. Headline 1. The European Union called on Israel to immediately end its Rafah operation. It was essentially an ultimatum. Stop operating in Rafah or imperil your relationship with Europe. The EU is Israel's most important trade partner, and Brussels is basically accusing Israel of causing mass human suffering by disrupting aid flows and evacuating civilians to unsafe areas. That's a lot of finger pointing for an operation that has not actually started. The war in Rafah is actually not underway. So far, Israel's operations in Rafah are limited. The long-awaited full-scale, real-deal operation hasn't begun. Someone has to explain to me the logic of condemning Israel for an operation that hasn't played out yet, because I'm struggling here. Imagine if the EU spent even half the energy it dedicated to preemptively condemning Israel and instead pressured Hamas, Iran, and Qatar to release the hostages. There's something about this conflict that makes everyone, even sensible Western governments, lose their collective minds. Headline 2, Israel renewed its water sharing agreement with Jordan for 6 months. Water is enshrined in this 1994 peace agreement that the two countries signed. Israel has been providing the resource-starved Hashemite kingdom with fresh water ever since. Israeli advances in desalination has certainly made this much easier. So in 2021, Jordan asked Israel to double the water supply. But by that point, Israeli-Jordanian peace had grown markedly cold. Still, Israel obliged and agreed to double the water transfers for 3 years. I'm all for making sure that Jordan has enough water. But you know what else I'm in favor of? Getting Foreign Minister Ayman Safadi to shut his trap. The senior Jordanian diplomat, if we can call him that, has relentlessly slammed Israel over the last 7 months for fighting a war that Hamas started. The king and his wife have not been much better. Admittedly, the kingdom did help thwart Iran's drone and missile attacks against Israel last month. That was one of the reasons why Israel, I think, agreed to extend the water deal, even if only for a half year. But for a longer deal to be made, there really does need to be a serious conversation about Jordan's nasty rhetoric. That talk is long overdue. And headline 3. A group of Jewish students filed an anti-Semitism lawsuit against Haverford College. The accusations are damning. Haverford faculty and staff didn't just allow anti-Semitism to flourish on campus. They actively participated in it. One professor called pro-Israel students racist genocidaires. The administration let that one go. The administration also forced students to cancel an anti-Semitism awareness event because it would offend Palestinian activists. But apparently, some student events accusing Israel of purposefully infecting Palestinians with COVID, well, that was fair game. This one hit close to home. I grew up about 2 miles from Haverford, but students are also taking other schools like Columbia and Harvard to court. The hate fests happening on college campuses are so bad that Congress has started to subpoena certain schools. In a recent letter to UCLA, Virginia Fox, the chairwoman of the Education Committee, slammed the universities for allowing violence and harassment to fester on campus. Congress is now asking UCLA to turn over internal documents related to the university's failure to shut down its encampment, protect its entire student body, and maintain order on campus. All right, it's time to talk about a somewhat morbid topic with my colleague David Adesnik. We're going to talk about those bogus Palestinian fatality numbers. David is also a Syria specialist, so we'll talk to him about what's happening there too. I should note that David is a Washington Nationals fan, so I'm going to try to take it easy on him this morning. Welcome, David Adesnik.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Last week, the UN cut by almost 50% its estimate of how many women and children have been killed in Gaza, cutting the number by more than 11,000. What happened? I mean, it's obviously hard to nail down facts in the middle of a war, but how can a number like that be off by 11,000?
Well, the very short answer is the number was made up, but I think it's important to give everyone a little bit of backstory. And the first thing you need to know is there have been 2 separate Hamas-controlled offices giving casualty data to the UN and to the media. So the first, probably the better known one, is the Ministry of Health, right? You often hear this is what local health authorities in Gaza are saying about the number of casualties. The second one is the Government Media Office in Gaza, as the name suggests. It puts out the talking points. And frankly, their estimates have diverged sharply. The ones from the Government Media Office have been even less credible. Admittedly, you have to reach pretty far to be less credible, but they have done it. For example, they've had cases where their numbers of men were so low in the total that it was below the number of male bodies that the ministry had recognized. So basically, what they do defies arithmetic, whereas you might say what the ministry does just defies common sense. And anyway, so the UN basically decided, okay, enough of these GMO, Government Media Office numbers. Let's go to the Ministry of Health instead.
Okay, well, all right. So let's unpack this further. Despite saying the estimate of women and children was off by 11,000, the UN says it is not revising downward its total estimate of the number of fatalities. How does that make any sense?
Well, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but we could sort of explain the logic they're trying to put out. So again, we got to begin with the split between 2 different Hamas-controlled authorities, both putting out numbers that are being consumed by the UN and by the media. So the GMO...
And by the way, by the President of the United States, by the U.S. government in some cases, correct?
Yeah. 2 critical cases to point out on that front. Biden, in the State of the Union address, used the figure of 30,000 dead. He did not say it was from the Gaza Health Ministry or that is controlled by Hamas. Also very interesting, in the big arms weapons report, which assessed Israeli behavior, the State Department said that we know these figures are coming from a Hamas-controlled entity, but because international organizations deem them credible, we treat them as credible too. I'll let you all ponder the weak link in that chain of logic. But anyway, getting back to where we have this divergence, and how does it make sense that you don't bring down the top line? So the way that the two sources have agreed on a single top line over time is there's a huge number of what the ministry calls unidentified deceased in their numbers, more than 10,000. The GMO never had that. They just apparently filled it in with the gender and age of their choice. But the thing is, that's not actually more credible. I mean, what the UN is basically doing is saying we're just switching from one system to the other. We're now going to say we have the lower total of women and children and a whole 10,000 plus unidentified. But what does unidentified really mean? The biggest misconception out there is that these are sad cases where you have remains and you can't identify the person. But this is not what the Ministry of Health itself has said. Rather, what they've been doing is they've said, we have such a hard time collecting the data we need. We are going to amplify what we have with, quote, reliable media sources. We are going to use these other reports. They've never specified which. They've never explained which reliable sources there are in Gaza. We're going to use them to count the dead. At first, it was a smaller percentage, maybe a fifth, and then it ballooned. So in the first 3 months of this year, 2024, fully 3/4 of the cases of death that they reported were actually derived from these reliable media sources, which are now relabeled as unidentified.
All right. Well, this is obviously some morbid stuff. I mean, let's zoom out for a second. I mean, maybe just tell me why all of this matters. It seems gruesome, even heartless, to be talking about precisely how many women and children have died. Clearly, there's tremendous suffering that's going on in Gaza. But so maybe just broaden down and explain why we should be looking at this.
Yeah, I completely agree. This is some terrible stuff. If you look at the individual stories of suffering, of whether it's the deceased, of the families, of all the hardship people are going through, no matter what your politics, it's going to pull at your heartstrings. But there's a broader question driving policy, which is to what degree is the Israel Defense Forces conducting this war in a responsible manner with concern for civilians and following the laws of war? To answer that question, you have to engage with these issues. So, for example, you see the claim frequently that Israel, 70% of those it has killed were women and children. That's one of the claims that has completely fallen apart with these new numbers, right? Because that was really based on the bad GMO numbers that have now been rejected. If you just look at the numbers the ministry has, depending on whether you count the unidentified or not, the percentage changes dramatically. It could be anywhere from 40 to 60, and there are even problems in the remaining data. So it's not as if we now have a different answer. We just know it's much lower, and that talking point has fallen apart. But look, we talked a minute ago about Biden using these numbers, the State Department using these numbers. These are critical pillars driving U.S. policy. And the U.S. policy, more and more, is to say that it seeks the defeat of Hamas and that it's siding firmly with Israel. But the headline every day is a different way the U.S. wants to put pressure on Israel because it believes it isn't doing what is necessary to protect civilians. If you change these numbers dramatically, perhaps you should change the entire policy, whose premise is that pressure on Israel is more important than pressure on Hamas.
Got it. So, in other words, if we're dealing with lies coming out of the Hamas health ministry or from government offices, and that's trickling down into U.S. policy, then we've got to actually address this at the source. Well, thank you for staying on this. I know you've been doing a lot of good work on that lately. But let's pivot for a second to a different topic. For years, you've been FDD's Syria guy, looking especially at how the U.S. can pressure Bashar al-Assad with sanctions or by preventing his theft of humanitarian aid, among other things. Where is this administration's policy on Syria right now? Has it changed since October 7th? How are we to understand how the U.S. is approaching the Assad regime?
Well, I think you and I might hope that after we see that Iran's network of proxies and client states helped to bring about this horrific attack on Israel, there would be an across-the-board tougher policy on those like Assad, who are Iranian clients who facilitate everything Iran does, shipping weapons across Syria to Hezbollah that could attack Israel. But no, the administration continues to hold out. It began for several months in office paying lip service to human rights as a priority, and then it pivoted, actually apparently following the advice of Jordan's king, to trying to reconcile Arab governments with Syria. Really, this culminated in Syria returning to the Arab League. So the meeting you mentioned earlier, the reason Bashar al-Assad is sitting there is in no small part because the U.S. sort of gave the quiet green light. If you ask the administration, they'll always say, no, we're not going to engage with Syria. But of course, the U.S. isn't going to reach out to Bashar al-Assad. The real question is the signals it's sending to its Arab partners, whether they should reach out to Assad. And one of the biggest issues is the administration is basically blocking tougher sanctions. It made efforts to get around sanctions by trying to approve a several $100 million deal for energy that would have given Assad a nice cut of that. And the other thing is they've been blocking legislation, right? Because Congress has a totally different perspective on this, and it's bipartisan. Every time Syria comes up for legislation that would be tougher on Assad in terms of sanctions, you're seeing 350 or 400 votes. I don't have to tell you, you don't get to that total without a pretty strong consensus in both parties. And in fact, there's been two pieces of legislation moving forward. So in that big foreign aid package that passed recently, Israel and Ukraine were the sort of the focal points of debate, but there was actually Syria legislation in there too, something called the Illicit Captagon Trafficking Suppression Act. And the idea there is Captagon's like an amphetamine, and Assad is shipping millions of this stuff around the region. It's how a desperate, corrupt regime brings in money when it doesn't have much and wants more than just Iranian handouts. And basically, the administration was under a lot of pressure and signed off on that. And apparently part of the deal, as the Washington Post reported, is that they wouldn't have to sign off on the, quote, Assad Regime Anti-Normalization Act, which is pivotal. It renews the Caesar Act sanctions, the toughest human rights sanctions we've put on Assad. They're not going to expire right away. There's going to be other bites at the apple. But frankly, the administration had a clear chance to say, we are fully behind pressure against Assad for all his roles in violating human rights, advancing Iranian interests. And it said, no, it said, we're not going to do that.
Okay. Well, one more question for you, time permitting here. What's our policy on those Shiite militias in Syria? I mean, we haven't really responded in full to those attacks that killed 3 service members back in late January. Yes, there were limited operations in the immediate aftermath, but these Shiite militias are still active. They're still arming themselves, and they're still ready to engage and fight Israel, perhaps the United States again in the future. So what should we be doing here? What would you say the right policy would be for the U.S. as it relates to these Iran-backed militias in Syria?
Right. So there's a real complicated mix. You have Iraqi Iran-backed militias. You have Syrian Iran-backed militias. You have Hezbollah over there, which of course is the grandfather, the biggest of all the Iran-backed militias in the region, the most potent. The policy, I'd say, has been to firmly bury our heads in the sands of the Syrian desert. It's to hopefully have this problem go away by doing as little as possible. It's basically a cousin of the Iran nuclear deal policy, that if we just keep talking to Iran, no matter what it does, the problem will go away, or worst comes to worst, at least it'll stay away until November 2024. What I would recommend if someone is attacking American forces, of course, killing 3 American troops in one instance, the basic principle of deterrence is you have to make it very clear to them that the price they pay for doing this will be far greater than the damage they inflict on us. And clearly, when you get headlines about American troops dying, the administration will do something for a short while. It'll say it attacked dozens of targets, but the things cool off for a little bit, and we are back to the old policy. So Iran gets a clear message that it's not going to be paying a heavy price.
I think that has been the message consistently throughout these past 7 months, unfortunately.
Credit for consistency.
Right. What's that?
Credit for consistency.
That's right. I suppose.
Credit for consistency.
Well, and credit to you for keeping up on both of these files. I want to thank you, David Adesnik, for joining us live today on the FDD Morning Brief.
Thank you.
All right, here's what FDD has on tap for you today. FDD China Program Director Craig Singleton, fresh off of his testimony before the House Homeland Security Committee, is tracking new legislation proposed in the House that would slap U.S. tariffs on Chinese-made drones and encourage the purchase of U.S.-made drones through a grant program. FDD's China program has been way ahead of the curve in warning on the threat to U.S. national security posed by these Chinese drones. FDD senior fellow and former Israeli national security advisor Jacob Nagel is out with a curtain raiser article on U.S. national security advisor Jake Sullivan's visit to Israel. Jacob examines the aims of the trip, namely to halt the war in Gaza, while dangling the prospect of Israeli-Saudi normalization. Jacob rightly notes that a deal with Saudi Arabia should not come at the cost of innocent hostages still held captive by Hamas. And finally, Deputy Director of FDD's Russia program, John Hardy, has a new piece in FDD's Long War Journal detailing Ukraine's recent replacement of the commander of its armed forces amidst Russia's ongoing offensive. That offensive began on May 10th with the aim of pressuring Kyiv into dividing its already scarce manpower. John emphasizes the precarious circumstances imposed by Russia on the Ukrainian military and civilians as this war takes new turns. It certainly feels like the tide is turning in this war, I'm concerned. That'll do it for today, folks. Read our expert analysis on our website, FDD.org. Read our quick takes on X at FDD and support our work with a tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. Tune in Monday for another can't-miss episode of the FDD Morning Brief. Thanks again for joining. I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.